I stood at the front door, my hand clutching the edge of it for balance. Tim was loading his suitcase into the back of a taxi. My son, my baby, was leaving for the RAF, and I was supposed to be proud. I was proud. But pride has a way of being swallowed up by loneliness. "Call me when you get there," I said, my voice catching. Tim, ever the composed young man, kissed my cheek and said, "I'll be fine, Mum. You'll see. It's just the next chapter." But as the taxi disappeared down the street, all I could see was the chapter of my life that was closing. The house felt emptier than ever when I turned back inside. I tried to fill the days. Work was a blur of emails and meetings, but even that didn't distract me. The house felt like an echo chamber when Dave was away, and even when he came home on weekends, it wasn't the same. "You're quiet, Catherine," Dave said one Saturday over dinner. "Everything okay?" I nodded, forcing a smile. "I'm fine, just adjusting to the quiet." But I wasn't fine. The truth was, I didn't know who I was without Tim needing me. And Dave, though loving, had never been the kind of man to notice the small fractures beneath the surface. Richard. He was the kind of man who didn't just enter a room, he took command of it. Broad-shouldered, with salt and pepper hair and an easy smile, he was the picture of confidence. I first noticed him at the company's quarterly review. He strode up to the podium with a charm that made the room lean in. But it wasn't until he started mentoring me on a major project that I found myself drawn to him in ways I hadn't felt in years. He had this way of listening, like every word I said mattered. He'd lean in just slightly, his cologne subtle but intoxicating, and I'd feel my heart race in a way I hadn't expected. It started innocently enough, late nights working together on presentations, brainstorming sessions that bled into long conversations about life. He talked about his wife, and I talked about Tim and Dave. But then there were the moments I didn't talk about. The way his hand would graze mine when he passed me papers. The way he'd laugh at my jokes, like I was the most fascinating person in the room. One evening, as we worked late, the rain started pounding against the office windows. Richard stood by the window, looking out, and said, "Sometimes I think life is just a series of moments we let slip by." I didn't know if it was the rain, the dim light, or the quiet between us, but I felt an ache rise in me. Before I could stop myself, I said, "Not all moments have to slip by." He turned, his eyes locking onto mine, and for a brief second, the world stopped. I'll never forget the day it all felt like it might spiral out of control. It started innocently, as most things do. I was leaving a meeting, my arms full of files, when I heard Richard call my name. His voice, deep and confident, always seemed to hold my attention longer than it should. "Catherine, hold the elevator." I pressed the button, my heart thumping in my chest as he stepped in, his cologne lingering in the small space between us. The doors closed, and the silence was almost suffocating. "Busy day?" he asked, his eyes meeting mine briefly before glancing at the files I was clutching. "Always," I replied, forcing a smile. He leaned slightly closer, his tone dropping. "You're doing great work, you know. I don't say it enough." His words washed over me, more intimate than professional. I tried to focus on the illuminated floor numbers, but my pulse quickened when the elevator jolted to a sudden stop. "Great," I muttered. Richard smirked. "I guess we're stuck." There was a moment, a charged, suspended moment, where neither of us said anything. The air felt heavier, his presence impossible to ignore. "You're too tense, Catherine," he said softly, his eyes lingering a little too long. "You should learn to relax." His words could have been harmless, but the way he said them, it was as if he'd peeled back a layer I didn't even know I had. It was nearly 10 p.m. when my phone rang. Dave was away, and I was curled up on the couch with a glass of wine, trying to lose myself in a novel. "Richard," I answered, surprised to see his name flashing on the screen. "Hope I'm not disturbing you," he said, his voice smooth and familiar. "Not at all," I lied, though I knew this wasn't exactly appropriate. He sighed. I was going over some reports and thought about that pitch you gave last week. You really impressed the client. I felt a flush of pride, but also confusion. Why was he calling me now, in the quiet of the night? Thank you, I said cautiously. That means a lot. There was a pause. Catherine, I think you underestimate yourself. You have this presence, this strength. His words felt like a thread pulling me toward him. I tried to steer the conversation back to work, but his compliments lingered long after we hung up. When Richard suggested I join him for a dinner meeting during a business trip, I told myself it was purely professional. It was just dinner, nothing more. The restaurant was intimate, with low lighting and soft jazz playing in the background. We discussed the client briefly, but the conversation quickly veered into personal territory. Do you ever feel like life boxes you in? He asked, swirling his wine. His question caught me off guard. I suppose. Sometimes, I admitted. He leaned closer, his gaze piercing. I see more in you, Catherine. I don't think you realize how remarkable you are. His words unraveled something inside me, a longing I hadn't realized I'd buried. I wanted to tell him to stop, to draw the line, but instead I found myself laughing at his jokes and sharing stories about my life. When the bill arrived, he insisted on paying. As we walked out into the cool night air, he lightly touched my arm. Catherine, he said, his voice low, I enjoy spending time with you. I didn't respond. I couldn't. The night it almost happened is etched into my mind like a scar. We were at a conference, away from the usual confines of our lives. Dinner turned into drinks, and drinks turned into a walk along the hotel's quiet hallways. When we stopped in front of my room, Richard hesitated. Good night, Catherine, he said softly, his voice lingering like a question. I looked up at him, my heart pounding. Good night, I whispered, but neither of us moved. Then he leaned in. My breath hitched as his lips brushed mine, but before the kiss could deepen, I pulled back. I can't, I said, my voice trembling. He nodded, stepping back. I'm sorry. You deserve to be happy, Catherine. Truly happy. The weight of his words stayed with me long after he walked away. The moment that changed everything came one rainy Friday evening. I had stayed late at the office to finish a report, and so had Richard. Catherine, you're still here? He asked, poking his head into my office. I wanted to wrap this up before the weekend, I said, avoiding his eyes. He stepped inside, closing the door behind him. The sound made my breath hitch. You worked too hard, he said, smiling. Then his tone shifted. Do you ever wonder what it would be like to just let go? I knew what he meant. The air between us felt electric, dangerous. My heart raced as he took a step closer. Richard, He stopped, his expression unreadable. I don't want to complicate your life, Catherine, but I can't ignore this connection. For a moment, I felt myself teetering on the edge of something I couldn't come back from. But then I thought of Tim, of Dave, of everything I'd built. I can't, I whispered, stepping back. His face softened and he nodded. I understand. He left the room and I sat down, my hands trembling.